The doors of the emergency room burst open before anyone could brace for it, and Maria Alvarez was already moving before the gurney crossed the threshold. "Gunshot wound! Multiple sites! Blood pressure dropping fast!" the paramedic shouted, running alongside the stretcher. "We lost his pulse twice in the ambulance." Maria's hands found the man's neck in an instant, checking for a carotid beat while her eyes swept his body for the worst of the damage. Blood soaked through layers of bandages that someone had already tried and failed to hold in place. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his breathing came in short, ragged pulls. "Get me 2 units of O negative now," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise of the trauma bay like a blade. "Someone page Dr. Whitfield. Tell her we need her here in 60 seconds, not 60 seconds from now, but immediately." There was no time to ask questions, no time to wonder why a man with no wallet, no phone, and no identification had been dropped off by a car that sped away before hospital security could even get a plate number. Maria had learned long ago that the moment for questions came after the moment for saving a life, never before. She tore open the packaging of a fresh bandage and pressed it hard against the wound just below his ribs, feeling the warmth of his blood soak through the fabric within seconds. His heart rate on the monitor was a thin, unsteady line, spiking and falling in a rhythm that told her his body was fighting a losing battle. "Stay with me," she said quietly, not sure if he could hear her, not sure if it mattered. "Whoever you are not doing this today." The trauma bay filled quickly. Nurses arrived with trays of instruments. A technician wheeled in a portable scanner, and somewhere behind her, Maria heard the doors swing open again as Dr. Karen Whitfield rushed in, pulling gloves onto her hands as she moved. "Talk to me," Whitfield said, taking her place across the table. 2 entry wounds, 1 exit. Pressure is 60/40 and falling. He's lost a lot of blood, and I think there's internal bleeding we can't see yet," Maria answered, never looking up from the wound in front of her. Whitfield's eyes moved briefly over the man's torso, and for a fraction of a second, her expression flickered with something Maria didn't expect. Not fear, not shock at the blood, something closer to confusion, as if she had noticed something odd, but didn't have time to say it out loud. There wasn't time to ask what it was. The monitor beside them let out a sharp, continuous tone, and the line on the screen went flat. "He's coding," a nurse called out. Maria didn't hesitate. She began compressions immediately, counting under her breath, her arms working in a steady, practiced rhythm that came from years of doing exactly this, over and over, in 100 different trauma bays for 100 different strangers. But something about this moment felt different, heavier, as if the walls of the room had pulled in closer to watch. "Charge to 200, Whitfield ordered, grabbing the defibrillator paddles. "Clear," Maria said, stepping back just long enough for the shock to pass through him. The line on the monitor jumped, then settled into a weak, uneven rhythm. Not strong, but there. A pulse. A chance. "We got him back," a nurse whispered. "Not for long if we don't stop this bleeding," Maria said, already pressing fresh gauze against the wound. "I need surgery ready in 5 minutes. He can't wait longer than that." Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, disciplined part of her brain kept a second count running, separate from the compressions, separate from the shouted orders. It was a habit she had built over years of nights just like this one, a way of keeping herself anchored when everything around her threatened to spiral into panic. 5 minutes to surgery, 4 minutes if his pressure dropped again. She refused to let herself think in terms of whether he survived, only how fast she could make sure that he did. A technician wheeled a portable ultrasound closer, and Maria guided the probe herself for a moment, scanning quickly for signs of fluid building where it shouldn't be. What she saw confirmed her fear, a slow, dark pool spreading beneath his ribs on the screen, invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable to anyone trained to look for it. "Internal bleeding confirmed. Upper abdominal quadrant," she called out. "He needs a surgeon's hands on this, not ours." The room moved around her in a blur of motion, phones being picked up, orders being shouted, wheels rolling across the floor as equipment was gathered. Maria kept her hands steady, kept her voice calm, kept her focus locked entirely on the man in front of her whose name she did not know, and whose life now depended entirely on the next few minutes. She noticed things most people would have missed in the chaos. The old scars along his shoulder that looked nothing like an accident. The way his body seemed built differently from most patients she treated. Lean muscles shaped by years of discipline rather than a gym membership. The faint outline of a tattoo on his forearm, partially hidden beneath the blood, that looked like a symbol she had seen only once before, a long time ago, in a photograph her late husband had kept in an old cigar box under their bed. She pushed the thought away. There was no room for memories right now. Blood pressure climbing, 70/50. A technician called out. "Keep it coming," Maria said. "We are not losing him." Every second felt stretched thin, like time itself had slowed to match the pace of her hands as she worked. She packed the wound, monitored his vitals, adjusted the IV line feeding blood back into his failing body, and watched the numbers on the screen with an intensity that blocked out everything else in the room. The overhead lights, the voices, even the fear that had settled quietly in her own chest, the fear she refused to let show on her face. Whitfield glanced at the clock mounted above the doorway. "It's been 6 minutes," she said. "He needs surgery within 2, Maria answered without looking up. "We're not going to make it if his pressure drops again." "It's not going to drop again," Maria said, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. She didn't know why she said it with such certainty. She didn't know why. In that moment, she felt an overwhelming need to make sure this particular stranger survived, more than she had felt with any patient in years. Maybe it was the scars. Maybe it was the tattoo. Maybe it was simply the way his jaw was clenched even while unconscious, as if some part of him was still fighting, still refusing to give up. The surgical team arrived at the 7-minute mark, moving with the urgency of people who understood exactly how little time remained. Maria helped transfer him onto the surgical gurney, keeping pressure on the wound the entire time, refusing to let go until the surgeon physically took over. "We've got him from here," the surgeon said. "Good work." Maria stepped back and watched as they wheeled him through the double doors toward the operating room, the monitors beeping steadily now instead of screaming in alarm. 8 minutes. 8 minutes from the second he arrived to the second he was stable enough for surgery. Her hands were still trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to fade, the way it always did after moments like this, when her body finally allowed itself to feel the weight of what had just happened. She peeled off her gloves and looked down at her scrubs, stained with blood that wasn't her own. Around her, the trauma bay slowly returned to its normal rhythm, nurses cleaning equipment, restocking supplies, the ordinary hum of a hospital continuing its work through the night. But something about this felt far from ordinary. She thought about the car that had dropped him off and disappeared before anyone could ask a single question. She thought about the absence of any identification, any wallet, any phone. She thought about the scars that told a story her training had taught her to recognize, even if she couldn't yet name exactly what that story was. "You did good in there," Whitfield said, appearing beside her and resting a hand briefly on her shoulder. "I don't know how you kept your hands so steady." "Years of practice," Maria said, though even to her own ears, the answer felt incomplete. A security guard leaned in through the doorway, speaking low to no one in particular. "Front desk says the vehicle that dropped him off is already gone. No plate on record, no driver description worth anything. Just pulled up, left him on the curb, and drove off before anyone could react." Nobody in the trauma bay answered him. There was nothing useful to say, and everyone in the room understood, without needing to discuss it, that this detail alone made the night different from any ordinary emergency call. Whitfield hesitated, glancing toward the hallway before lowering her voice. "Did you notice his injuries? The old ones, I mean, not from tonight." Maria nodded slowly. "I noticed. I've never seen scarring like that on a patient before. Not from surgery, not from an accident." Whitfield paused, choosing her next words carefully. It almost looked like combat wounds. The word hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. Before Maria could respond, the sound of the main entrance doors sliding open echoed down the hallway, followed by the brisk, measured footsteps of more than one person, walking with purpose. She turned toward the sound instinctively, the same way she always turned toward anything unexpected in her hospital, some instinct built from years of trusting her senses more than she trusted explanations. 2 figures in dark suits walked through the corridor, flashing badges toward the front desk attendant, who pointed them further inside without hesitation. Behind them walked a third figure in a naval uniform, posture straight, expression unreadable, moving with the same quiet urgency as the two men beside him. Maria felt something tighten in her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite explain, as she watched them approach the nurses' station, with clear intention in every step. "I'm looking for whoever treated the patient who came in 15 minutes ago," one of the suited men said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of voice that expected answers quickly and without argument. The trauma bay, still buzzing quietly with the aftermath of the emergency, seemed to fall silent all at once. Maria stepped forward, wiping her hands on a clean towel, her heart beating just a little faster than she wanted to admit. "That would be me," she said. The man's eyes moved over her carefully, taking in every detail, the same way she had studied her patient only minutes earlier. For a long moment, nobody spoke. "We need to ask you some questions," he said finally, "about exactly what you saw tonight." Maria stood her ground, though her pulse had not fully settled from the last 8 minutes. "I'll answer what I can," she said, "but I have other patients tonight." "This will not take long," the taller of the two men said. He introduced himself as Agent Owen Marsh, and the woman beside him as Agent Nora Pierce. The man in uniform gave only a short nod. "Commander Lisa Grant," he said, Navy. Frank Doyle, the hospital's night administrator, arrived moments later, his tie loosened, his forehead shining with the particular sweat of a man who had just been woken from a deep sleep and told federal agents were standing in his hospital. He inserted himself between Maria and the agents with the practiced smile of someone trying to manage a situation far bigger than himself. "Whatever this is about, I'm sure we can accommodate you," Doyle said, his eyes darting between the badges and Maria's blood-stained scrubs. "Is there a room we can use? Somewhere private?" "That would be appreciated," Agent Pierce said, her tone polite but final, the kind of politeness that left no room for negotiation. They were led to a small conference room down the hall, the kind usually reserved for family meetings when doctors had to deliver news nobody wanted to hear. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Maria took a seat across from the two agents, with Commander Grant standing near the door, arms folded, watching everything with careful, unreadable eyes. "Let's start simple," Marsh said, opening a small notebook. "Walk us through exactly what happened when the patient arrived." Maria recounted the details as clearly as she could. The unmarked car pulling up outside. No identification on the patient. The paramedics who had picked him up from a location they refused to specify over the radio. The 2 gunshot wounds. The internal bleeding, the 8 minutes of work that followed. Pierce listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily across a notepad, though Maria noticed she wrote far less than what was actually being said, as though she were only marking down certain phrases rather than transcribing the whole account. "You mentioned old scarring," Pierce said when Maria finished. "Can you describe what you saw?" Maria hesitated only slightly. Scar tissue along his shoulder and lower back, consistent with previous trauma, not surgical in nature. There was also a partial tattoo on his forearm, though I couldn't see all of it through the blood. Marsh and Pierce exchanged a brief glance, one that lasted less than a second but carried an entire conversation neither of them spoke aloud. "Did you document that in his chart?" Marsh asked. "Yes. It's standard procedure to note visible identifying marks and prior injuries, especially for a patient without ID. We're going to need a copy of that chart," Pierce said. Doyle, still hovering near the doorway, cleared his throat. Of course. Whatever you need, we want to fully cooperate." "We appreciate that," Commander Grant said, speaking for the first time since introducing herself. Her voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone used to controlling a room without raising her voice. "I want to be clear that this patient's status, his identity, and any details of tonight's incident are classified. Nothing said in this room leaves this room." Maria felt the temperature of the conversation shift, subtle but unmistakable, like a change in air pressure before a storm. "Am I in some kind of trouble?" Maria asked, keeping her voice steady, despite the question pressing uncomfortably against her chest. "Not at all," Pierce said quickly, though her expression didn't quite match the reassurance in her words. "We're simply trying to understand exactly what information may have been recorded, and by whom, given the sensitivity of this situation. Doyle shifted uncomfortably by the door. Nurse Alvarez is one of our most experienced trauma nurses. If she noted something in the chart, it's because it was medically relevant. We don't doubt her competence, Marsh said. We're more interested in her precision. The word landed strangely in the room, and Maria felt herself sit up a little straighter. What do you mean? Pierce flipped open a folder Maria hadn't noticed before, sliding a printed copy of the digital chart across the table. Several lines had been highlighted in yellow. Entry wound consistent with a small caliber tactical round, Pierce read aloud. Wound pattern suggests close-range engagement rather than accidental discharge. Scarring pattern, consistent with prior combat exposure, not civilian trauma. Maria's stomach tightened as she heard her own clinical language read back to her, stripped of context, sounding far more specific and far more informed than she had intended. That's standard trauma terminology, Maria said carefully. I document what I observe based on wound characteristics. It's part of my job. Most ER nurses don't distinguish between tactical rounds and standard ammunition in their notes, Marsh said, his tone even, but his eyes studying her closely now, searching for something beneath her words. Where did you learn to make that distinction? The question hung in the air, simple on its surface but heavy underneath, the kind of question that could shift an entire conversation, depending on how it was answered. Maria thought, for just a moment, about the cigar box under her old bed, about pages of a worn field manual she had read more times than she could count, about a man she had loved and lost and rarely spoke of anymore. But this was not the moment to explain that. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what kind of room she was sitting in, and exactly what kind of trouble that answer could bring. 10 years in trauma medicine, she said instead. You see enough gunshot wounds, you start to notice patterns. Pierce studied her for a long moment before closing the folder. We may need to speak with you again, formally, tomorrow if possible. I have a shift tomorrow evening, Maria said. We'll work around it, Commander Grant said, her tone leaving no space for further discussion. Marsh closed his notebook and slid it into his jacket pocket, though his eyes lingered on Maria a moment longer than necessary. One more thing, he said. Did the patient say anything before he lost consciousness in the ambulance, or once he arrived here? Any words at all, even ones that didn't make sense? Maria thought back carefully, replaying the chaotic first seconds in her mind. Nothing coherent. A few sounds, maybe part of a word, but nothing I could make out clearly. He was barely conscious by the time he reached us. If you remember anything else, even something that seems unimportant, we need to know immediately, Pierce said, sliding a small card across the table with a direct contact number printed on it. Day or night. Maria took the card, turning it over once in her fingers before slipping it into her pocket. Understood. Doyle, still hovering nervously near the door, seemed to relax slightly now that the questioning had wound down. Will you need anything else from administration tonight? A list of everyone with access to the surgical wing in the last 12 hours, Grant said. Names, badge numbers, shift times. We'll want it by morning. Of course, Doyle said quickly, already reaching for his phone. As the meeting broke apart, Pierce lingered near the doorway while Marsh and Grant stepped out into the hallway ahead of her, speaking quietly to one another in tones too low for Maria to catch. Doyle stepped forward again, his voice climbing slightly with nervous energy. Is there anything the hospital needs to do? Any protocols we should follow given the sensitivity here? Limit access to the surgical wing, Grant said. We'll be posting additional security near his recovery room once he's out of surgery. Staff on a need-to-know basis only. Understood, Doyle said quickly, already pulling out his phone to make calls. As the meeting wound down, Maria stood, her legs feeling stiffer than she expected after the tension of the last several minutes. Agent Pierce stopped her at the door. Nurse Alvarez, she said, her voice quieter now, almost curious rather than accusatory. Whoever that man is, whatever mission he was part of tonight, it did not go according to plan. We are trying to understand exactly how and why and who else may have been involved in what happened to him before he ever reached your hospital. I understand, Maria said, though the weight behind Pierce's words left her with more questions than she had walked in with. We're not accusing you of anything, Pierce added, but precision, in a moment like tonight, is not something we can afford to overlook. Maria nodded and stepped out into the hallway, the fluorescent lights suddenly feeling too bright, too sharp against her tired eyes. Down the corridor she could see two uniformed officers already taking position outside the doors leading toward the surgical recovery wing, their presence a quiet, unmistakable signal that something far bigger than a single gunshot victim had entered her hospital tonight. She made her way back toward the nurses' station, her mind replaying the conversation over and over, trying to understand exactly how a routine trauma call had turned into a room full of federal agents questioning her choice of words. A young nurse named Ellie approached her cautiously, glancing toward the hallway where the agents had disappeared. "Is everything okay? People are saying there are FBI agents here." "Everything's fine," Maria said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Just following protocol for a sensitive case." Ellie didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway and returned to her station, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts for the first time since the trauma bay doors had burst open earlier that night. By the time Maria made her way to the break room for a few minutes of quiet, the rumor had already spread through the entire floor. Two orderlies whispered near the coffee machine about a soldier brought in under armed guard. A resident physician asked, half joking and half serious, whether the hospital had somehow become the backdrop for a government thriller overnight. Maria said nothing to any of them, letting the speculation pass by without confirmation or denial, aware that the less she said, the safer everyone around her would remain. She sat alone for a moment, staring at the vending machine without really seeing it, her thoughts drifting unwillingly toward the cigar box waiting for her at home, toward memories she had spent years keeping carefully folded away. She hadn't thought about Eric's old field manuals in months, yet tonight, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, they kept surfacing in her mind, unbidden and insistent, as if some part of her already sensed she would need them again soon. She glanced toward the surgical wing, where her patient, still unnamed to her, still a mystery wrapped in scars and silence, was fighting for his life under the hands of surgeons she trusted completely. She thought about the tattoo she had glimpsed beneath the blood, the symbol that had stirred something familiar and unsettling in the back of her mind, something she hadn't allowed herself to fully examine yet. An hour later, word came through that the surgery had been successful. The bleeding had been controlled, the internal damage repaired, and the patient was now listed in critical but stable condition, resting under heavy sedation in a recovery room now guarded around the clock. The surgeon who delivered the update, a quiet, steady man named Dr. Adrian Voss, found Maria near the nurses' station and pulled her aside briefly before heading home for the night. "Whoever worked on him before he reached my table did excellent work," Voss said. "Another few minutes of blood loss, and there wouldn't have been much left for me to fix. I just kept him alive long enough to reach you," Maria said. "That's the hardest part of the job, most nights," Voss said, offering a tired but genuine smile before disappearing down the hallway toward the elevators. Maria felt a small measure of relief at the news, though it was tempered by the unresolved tension still coiled tightly in her chest. She had done her job. She had saved a life. And yet, walking back toward the locker room to finally end her shift, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real story of that night was only just beginning. Two uniformed officers had already taken up permanent positions outside the recovery wing by the time she passed, their presence a quiet, constant reminder that whatever had happened to the man now sleeping behind that guarded door was far from over. She wondered, briefly, whether he had a family somewhere, waiting for news that might never come through official channels, and the thought stayed with her long after she had changed out of her scrubs and gathered her things to leave. As she reached for her jacket, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, 3 words typed plainly on the screen. "We'll be in touch." She stared at the message for a long moment before slipping the phone into her pocket, aware that whatever had walked through those hospital doors tonight had not left when the surgery ended. It had simply moved deeper into the shadows of her life, waiting for the next conversation to begin. The drive home felt longer than usual, the streets empty at that hour, streetlights blinking past her windshield in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Twice she caught herself checking her mirrors, though she couldn't have said exactly what she expected to see behind her. A dark sedan idled 2 houses down from her own as she pulled into the driveway, and she told herself it belonged to a neighbor, though she didn't recognize it, and didn't linger outside long enough to be sure. Inside, the house was quiet, Tyler already asleep with his bedroom door cracked open the way he always left it since he was small, a habit neither of them had ever spoken about, but both understood without needing to. Maria stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her son sleep, feeling the events of the night settle over her like a heavy blanket she hadn't asked to carry. She made her way to the hallway closet, pulling down the small cigar box from its place on the top shelf, dust gathering faintly along its edges. She didn't open it that night. She only held it for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it in her hands, before returning it carefully to its shelf and closing the closet door. Sleep, when it finally came, was thin and restless, filled with fragmented images of trauma bays and unmarked cars, and a stranger's tattoo she couldn't quite bring into focus, no matter how hard she tried. The next afternoon, Maria arrived at the hospital 3 hours before her scheduled shift, summoned by a call from Frank Doyle that morning, his voice tight with a nervousness he hadn't bothered to hide. "They want to speak with you again," he'd said. Formally this time, in the main conference room upstairs. She had barely slept, her mind cycling through the events of the previous night over and over. The scars, the tattoo, the strange precision of her own chart notes, read back to her like evidence in a courtroom. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing plain clothes instead of scrubs, feeling somehow that this conversation required a different version of herself than the one who worked the trauma bay. When she arrived, the hospital felt different, quieter. A pair of unfamiliar security personnel stood near the elevator leading to the surgical wing, badges clipped to dark jackets, eyes scanning everyone who passed. Doyle met her near the entrance, his usual composure replaced by visible unease. "They've been here since early this morning," he said quietly as they walked toward the elevator, reviewing footage, records, staff schedules. "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of running this hospital." "Do they think someone here was involved?" Maria asked. Doyle hesitated. "I don't know what they think. Nobody's telling me anything. They just keep asking for more access." He lowered his voice as they stepped into the elevator, glancing at the closed doors as if the walls themselves might be listening. "The board called me at 5 this morning. Apparently there's talk of the hospital being considered for a federal trauma partnership, something to do with rapid response contracts for military personnel. This kind of attention could either make us or break us, depending on how it plays out." "So there's pressure," Maria said. "There's always pressure," Doyle said with a tired laugh that carried no real humor in it. "I just need this resolved quickly, one way or another, for the hospital's sake, and honestly, for yours as well. I don't like how closely they're looking into your background." Maria felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. "What do you mean, my background?" "They pulled personnel files this morning. Yours, along with a handful of others who had access to the surgical wing last night. I don't think it means anything, but I wanted you to hear it from me before you walked in there." The elevator doors opened, and Doyle offered a small, apologetic nod before leading her down the hallway toward the conference room, the weight of his warning settling uncomfortably over her shoulders with every step. The conference room upstairs looked different in daylight than it had the night before, though the tension inside it felt exactly the same. Agent Pierce and Agent Marsh sat on one side of a long table, a laptop open between them, while Commander Grant stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the parking lot below with quiet intensity. "Thank you for coming in," Pierce said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from them. "We have some additional questions." Maria sat down, folding her hands in front of her, trying to project a calm she didn't entirely feel. "I already told you everything I know." "We'd like to go over a few details again," Marsh said, turning the laptop slightly so she could see the screen. It displayed a timeline, marked with precise minutes and seconds, tracking the patient's arrival, her initial assessment, and every action taken in the trauma bay. "Walk us through this timeline, step by step." Maria did as they asked, recounting the same sequence of events from the night before, though this time the agents interrupted more frequently, asking about specific movements, specific words she had used with the surgical team, specific observations about the patient's condition. "You mentioned recognizing the wound as consistent with a tactical round," Marsh said. "Talk me through how you reached that conclusion in the moment." "The wound margins were clean, with minimal fragmentation," Maria explained. "That's typical of higher velocity rounds used in tactical firearms, compared to the wider tearing you often see from standard handguns. That's a very specific distinction to make under pressure, Pierce said, studying her closely. I've treated gunshot wounds for a decade, Maria said. You learn to read the damage quickly, because the treatment depends on it. Marsh tapped a few keys on the laptop, pulling up a second document, a list of names Maria recognized as fellow staff members who had been on shift the night before. We've spoken with the rest of your team already. None of them used the same terminology you did. None of them identified the wound type with that level of specificity. Different people notice different things, Maria said. That doesn't make it suspicious. We're not calling it suspicious, Pierce said carefully. We're calling it unusual. And in an investigation like this one, unusual details tend to matter more than they would anywhere else. Maria felt her patience thinning slightly, though she kept her voice level. With respect, I understand you have a job to do, but I also have patients waiting on me tonight, and I'd like to understand exactly how much longer this is going to take. As long as it needs to, Marsh said simply, not unkindly, but without any give in his tone either. Commander Grant turned away from the window, her expression unreadable but her attention now fully on the conversation. Nurse Alvarez, I want to be direct with you. The man you treated last night was part of a classified operation that did not go as planned. We are trying to determine how the mission was compromised, and whether anyone outside of authorized personnel had prior knowledge of details that should not have been known. Maria felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the room. Are you suggesting I had some kind of prior knowledge about a classified mission? We're suggesting nothing yet, Grant said. We're simply gathering facts. Your notes contained language that suggested more familiarity with tactical injuries than we typically see from civilian medical staff. We need to understand where that familiarity comes from. I told you already, Maria said, her voice firmer now, though her heart pounded harder beneath her calm exterior. Years of trauma experience. With respect, Marsh said, leaning forward slightly. We've reviewed your professional history. Nothing in your background suggests exposure to tactical or combat-related trauma beyond standard civilian gunshot cases. Yet last night, within moments of examining a patient with no identification, you correctly identified injury patterns typically seen only by military or combat medical personnel. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words pressing down on all of them. I'm not hiding anything, Maria said, though even to her own ears, the statement sounded incomplete, as if some part of her already understood there was more to say, even if she wasn't ready to say it yet. Pierce exchanged a glance with Marsh before speaking again, her tone softer this time, almost coaxing. Sometimes people carry knowledge without realizing its significance, until someone asks the right question. Is there anything in your personal history, anything at all, that might explain how you recognize those patterns so precisely? Maria felt the question settle over her like a weight, pressing against a part of her past she rarely spoke about, a part of her life stored away in the same cigar box as old photographs and a folded flag she kept in the back of her closet. She thought about deflecting again, about repeating the same simple explanation she had given the night before. But something in the seriousness of the room, in the quiet urgency behind Commander Grant's eyes, told her that the truth mattered more right now than her own discomfort in sharing it. She glanced toward the window, where afternoon light spilled across the parking lot in long, quiet stripes, and thought about how strange it was that a single ordinary night could unravel so much of what she had spent years trying to keep folded neatly away. She thought about the careful way Eric used to describe his work, always choosing his words with precision, never revealing more than necessary, a habit she realized now she had unconsciously absorbed into her own way of speaking, without ever noticing it happening. Still, she hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, unsure whether opening that door would help her case or somehow make things worse. "Can I ask you something first?" Maria said. Pierce nodded. "Go ahead." "Is the man I treated last night going to be okay?" The three of them exchanged glances, a brief, unspoken conversation passing between them, before Commander Grant finally answered. "He's stable. Still critical, but stable. The doctors believe he'll recover, thanks in large part to how quickly he was treated last night." A small measure of relief passed through Maria, though it did little to ease the tension building in the room around her. His name is Daniel Cole, Grant continued, her voice quieter now, almost as if sharing the information cost her something. He is a member of a special operations unit. Last night's mission was compromised in a way that resulted in significant casualties among his team. He was the only one to make it out, though barely. The weight of that information settled heavily over the room, and Maria felt a fresh wave of understanding wash over her. Understanding the true scale of what had happened the night before. Understanding why federal agents and naval officers had descended upon her hospital within hours of his arrival. "I didn't know any of that," Maria said quietly. "I just saw a man who was dying, and I did what I was trained to do." "We believe you," Pierce said, "but we need to understand the full picture before we can close this part of our investigation. And right now, your notes remain the one detail we can't fully explain." Doyle, who had been sitting quietly near the door throughout the conversation, cleared his throat nervously. "Is there anything the hospital can do to help resolve this more quickly? We have federal agents in our building, security posted throughout the surgical wing, and frankly, the staff are beginning to ask a lot of questions we can't answer." "We understand the disruption," Grant said, "but this cannot be rushed. Too much is at stake." Maria felt the room tighten around her again, felt the unspoken suspicion still lingering beneath the surface of every question they asked. She understood, in that moment, that this was not simply about clearing her name. It was about a mission gone wrong, about men who had not made it home, about a country trying to understand exactly how and why one of its most capable operators had ended up bleeding out in her trauma bay with no explanation and no warning. "I want to help," Maria said finally, "but I need you to understand something too. Whatever happened last night, whatever mission went wrong, I had absolutely nothing to do with it. My only involvement began the moment those doors opened, and a man's life was in my hands." "We understand that," Pierce said, "but understanding where your instincts came from last night is part of understanding the full sequence of events. It might seem unrelated to you, but sometimes the smallest details end up explaining the biggest gaps." Maria sat in silence for a long moment, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her shoulders like something physical. She thought about her late husband, about the years she had spent quietly absorbing pieces of his world without ever truly being part of it, about the knowledge she had unknowingly carried within her for years, waiting, it seemed, for a night exactly like the one before. "There's something I haven't told you," Maria said finally, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter building in her chest. "Something that might explain everything you're asking about." The room fell completely silent, every eye now fixed on her, waiting. "My husband Eric was a combat medic," Maria began, her voice quiet but steady, the words carrying the weight of a history she had kept mostly to herself for years. "He served for 8 years before he passed away. Car accident, nothing related to his service, just bad timing on a rainy road 3 years ago." She paused, gathering her thoughts, aware that every person in the room was now listening with complete attention. A memory surfaced clearly in her mind, one she hadn't visited in years. Eric, sitting at their kitchen table late one night, a cup of coffee long gone cold beside him, spreading photographs across the surface that she wasn't technically supposed to see. He hadn't meant to show her, she realized later. He had simply forgotten to put them away before she walked in, and once she had seen them, he decided there was little point in pretending otherwise. "This one," he had said, pointing to a faded image of a wound pattern, "is what happens when someone gets caught by shrapnel instead of a direct round. See how it spreads instead of punching through clean? Completely different treatment approach." He had spoken about it the way other people discussed weather patterns or sports statistics. A strange, clinical calm layered over subjects most people would find deeply unsettling. At the time, Maria had asked very few questions, understanding instinctively that there were parts of Eric's work he needed to release into words occasionally, not because he wanted her to fully understand them, but because carrying them silently for too long became its own kind of burden. She had listened, nodded, asked simple questions when it felt appropriate, and never imagined that those quiet kitchen conversations would someday matter beyond the walls of their own home. When we were married, he used to bring home stories, not details of missions, nothing classified, just stories about the kinds of injuries he treated overseas. He kept old field manuals in a box in our closet, pages worn thin from studying them so many times. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he would show me photographs, explain what certain wounds looked like, why they mattered, why understanding the difference between a tactical round and a standard bullet could mean the difference between saving someone's life and losing them. Agent Pierce leaned forward slightly, her earlier suspicion softening into something closer to careful curiosity. You learned this from him. I learned it without realizing I was learning it, Maria said. It wasn't training. It wasn't something I studied formally. It was just being married to someone who lived in that world for years, who couldn't fully leave it behind even when he came home. I absorbed pieces of it without ever meaning to. And after he passed, I kept that box. I still have it. I never looked at it as anything more than a way of holding on to him. Commander Grant's posture shifted slightly, some of the rigid formality easing from her shoulders. What was your husband's unit? Maria hesitated only briefly before answering, and when Grant heard the details, something in her expression changed entirely, the guarded suspicion replaced by a quiet, dawning recognition. I know that unit, Grant said softly. Daniel Cole trained with several men from that same group early in his career. It's a small community. Everyone eventually crosses paths. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension that had built steadily over the past 2 days, finally beginning to loosen. So this wasn't knowledge she gained through improper channels, Marsh said, glancing toward Pierce. It's personal history, grief, memory, absorbed information from a spouse's career. It explains the precision, Pierce said, closing her laptop slowly. It explains everything, honestly. She wasn't drawing on classified knowledge. She was drawing on years of quiet exposure to a world her husband lived in, but rarely spoke about directly. Maria felt something loosen in her own chest as well, a tension she hadn't fully realized she was carrying until it began to ease. I wasn't trying to hide anything from you, she said. I just wasn't sure how to explain something so personal in a room full of federal agents asking about classified operations. We understand, Grant said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. Grief affects people in unexpected ways. Sometimes it becomes knowledge we don't even realize we're carrying until the moment we need it most. Pierce sat back in her chair, the sharp edge of formal interrogation replaced now by something closer to simple conversation. For what it's worth, Nurse Alvarez, the skill you showed last night likely saved Daniel Cole's life. If you had hesitated even for a moment, if you had missed the severity of his internal bleeding, we may not be having this conversation at all. I just did my job, Maria said quietly, though the words felt lighter now, no longer weighed down by suspicion. Doyle, who had remained largely silent throughout the last several minutes, finally spoke up, relief evident in his voice. Does this mean the investigation into the hospital is concluded? Our staff, our procedures, everything checks out? As far as the hospital is concerned, yes, Marsh said. Our focus now shifts elsewhere. The mission was compromised through channels unrelated to this facility. We have reason to believe the breach originated overseas, likely through compromised communication, rather than anything connected to civilian medical staff. Pierce leaned back in her chair, some of the sharpness gone from her posture now, replaced by something closer to quiet respect. For what it's worth, Nurse Alvarez, most people in your position would have simply repeated the same vague answer over and over, rather than risk sharing something so personal. That took a certain kind of courage. It didn't feel like courage, Maria said. It felt like finally putting down something heavy I'd been carrying alone for a long time. Marsh closed the laptop fully this time, the earlier tension in his shoulders visibly easing. We'll finalize our report today. As far as this investigation is concerned, your involvement is limited strictly to your role as treating nurse. Nothing more. A quiet relief spread through the room, though Maria noticed Commander Grant remained thoughtful, her eyes distant for a moment before she spoke again. Nurse Alvarez, I want to thank you personally, Grant said. Not just for what you did medically last night, though that alone deserves recognition, but for being honest with us today, even when it clearly cost you something to share it. It felt strange talking about Eric like that, Maria admitted. I don't talk about him much, not even with my son. How old is your son? Pierce asked, her tone gentler now, curiosity replacing suspicion entirely. 16, Maria said. Tyler. He was young when his father passed, and it's been hard for him. Harder than either of us like to admit most days. The room settled into a quieter rhythm after that, the earlier tension replaced by something closer to mutual understanding. Marsh gathered his notes, Pierce closed her folder, and Commander Grant walked toward the window once more, looking out over the parking lot with an expression that seemed, for the first time since Maria had met her, genuinely at ease. There's something else you should know, Grant said, turning back toward Maria. Daniel Cole is beginning to regain consciousness. The doctors expect him to be lucid within the next day or two. Maria felt a small, unexpected warmth at the news. That's good to hear. He may want to speak with you, Grant added. Once he's stable enough, it's not uncommon for someone who survives something like this to want to meet the person responsible for their survival. I'd be honored, Maria said, surprising herself slightly with how easily the words came. As the meeting began to wind down, Doyle escorted the agents toward the elevator, already discussing logistics for scaling back the security presence now that the investigation into hospital involvement had concluded. Maria remained behind for a moment, alone in the conference room, staring out the same window Commander Grant had been looking through only minutes earlier. She thought about Eric, about the box of old manuals still tucked away in her closet, about the years she had spent quietly carrying pieces of his world, without ever fully realizing how deeply they had shaped her. She thought about Tyler, about how rarely she spoke of his father these days, and how strange it felt to have shared more about Eric with federal agents in one afternoon than she had shared with her own son in years. She thought, too, about Daniel Cole, a man she had never truly met, whose life she had held quite literally in her hands for 8 critical minutes. A man whose recovery now felt tied to her own, in ways she hadn't expected when she woke up that morning. She stopped by the small hospital chapel on her way back to the trauma floor, an old habit she rarely admitted to anyone, not out of any particular faith but simply because the quiet of the room offered a kind of stillness she couldn't find anywhere else in the building. She sat for a few minutes, thinking about Eric, about the strange, roundabout way his memory had reached forward through time to help save a stranger's life, and about how she would finally explain all of this to Tyler when the moment felt right. Walking out of the conference room, Maria felt lighter than she had in days, though a quiet anticipation lingered beneath the relief. The investigation was closing, the suspicion lifting, but something told her this story wasn't quite finished yet. Somewhere down the hall, behind a guarded door, a man was slowly waking up, carrying his own version of the same night she had lived through, and soon, for the first time, the two of them would finally meet face to face. 3 days later, Maria received a message from Commander Grant, asking if she would be willing to visit the recovery wing before her evening shift began. She agreed without hesitation, though her stomach fluttered with a nervous energy she hadn't expected to feel over something as simple as a hospital visit. The guarded door leading into Daniel Cole's recovery room had lost some of its intimidating presence over the past few days, though the officer stationed outside still checked her identification carefully before allowing her through. Inside, the room was quiet, sunlight filtering through half-open blinds, the steady beep of monitoring equipment the only sound breaking the silence. Daniel Cole looked different from the man she remembered on the trauma table. His color returned, his breathing steady and unaided now, though the exhaustion of his ordeal still lingered clearly in his eyes. He turned his head slightly as she entered, studying her with the quiet focus of someone trying to place a face from a memory shrouded in pain and adrenaline. "You're the one," he said, his voice hoarse but clear, "the nurse from that night." "Maria Alvarez," she said, stepping closer to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Alive," he said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face, "which, from what I've been told, is largely thanks to you." Maria felt a familiar warmth rise in her chest, though she brushed the compliment aside with the same humility she always did. "I just did my job." 8 minutes, Daniel said. "That's what they told me. 8 minutes between arriving at your hospital and being stable enough for surgery. I've seen men lose their lives in less time than that." "You fought hard to stay alive," Maria said. "I just helped keep the door open long enough for the surgeons to finish the job." Daniel studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind his tired eyes. "They told me about your husband. Eric Alvarez. I didn't know him personally, but men from his old unit trained some of the instructors I had early in my career. Small world, this line of work. It seems that way, Maria said softly. I imagine it wasn't easy, talking to federal agents about him, Daniel said. Grant told me a little about what happened during the investigation. It wasn't easy, Maria admitted. But it helped, in a strange way. I don't talk about Eric much anymore, not even with my son. Grief has a strange way of staying quiet until it's needed most, Daniel said. I've seen that more times than I'd like to admit. Can I ask you something? Daniel said after a moment. Of course. That night, when you first saw me, did you know how bad it was? Really know. I mean, not just guessing. Maria considered the question honestly before answering. I knew you were close to the edge. I've seen enough patients over the years to recognize that particular kind of stillness the body gets right before it starts giving up. But I also knew we still had time, even if it wasn't much. How did you know that? I didn't, not for certain, she admitted. But I've learned that believing there's still time is sometimes the only thing keeping a patient alive long enough to prove it true. Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying the ceiling above his bed as though searching for the right words. In my line of work, we're taught to trust our training completely, to never hesitate, because hesitation costs lives. Listening to you just now, I think you operate the same way, even if nobody ever gave you the same kind of formal instruction. Maybe grief teaches its own kind of training, Maria said quietly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two strangers connected now by a night neither of them would ever fully forget, though they had experienced it from entirely different sides of the same struggle. I wanted to thank you properly, Daniel said eventually. Not just for the medical work, though that alone deserves more gratitude than I know how to express, but for staying calm, for not panicking, even when you clearly understood how serious things were. You weren't the only one fighting that night, Maria said. I think some part of me refused to let you go, the moment I saw those old scars, and realized exactly what kind of life you must have lived. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding passing quietly between them, without the need for further explanation. Over the following weeks, as Daniel Cole's recovery progressed steadily under the careful watch of the hospital's medical staff, Maria found herself returning often to check on him, their brief hallway conversations slowly becoming something closer to genuine friendship. He shared, in careful, measured pieces, small parts of his life that he was permitted to speak about, while Maria, in turn, found herself opening up more about Eric than she had allowed herself to in years, the weight of old grief slowly beginning to ease under the simple relief of finally being heard. On the day Daniel Cole was finally discharged, transferred to a military medical facility for the remainder of his recovery, he asked to see Maria one last time before leaving. She found him sitting upright in a wheelchair near the exit, dressed in plain civilian clothes for the first time since she had met him, looking stronger than she had ever seen him, though still carrying the careful, measured movements of someone whose body hadn't fully forgiven him yet. I won't forget this, Daniel said, extending his hand toward her. Or you. Take care of yourself, Maria said, shaking his hand warmly, and try to give your body a little more time to heal than your training probably wants you to. He laughed softly, the first genuine laugh she had heard from him. I'll try. No promises. As the orderly wheeled him toward the waiting vehicle outside, he turned back once more. If you ever need anything, Maria, anything at all, Commander Grant knows how to reach me. I hope I never have to test that, she said, smiling. Fair enough, he said, offering a final nod before disappearing through the sliding doors into the bright afternoon sunlight. One evening, as Maria prepared to leave after her shift, Frank Doyle approached her near the nurse's station, an envelope in his hand and an expression of quiet pride on his face. This came for you today, he said, handing her the envelope carefully. Delivered directly from the Department of Defense. Maria opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the formal, carefully worded letter inside, thanking her for her exceptional medical care under extraordinary circumstances, acknowledging the critical role her actions played in saving the life of a decorated service member. She read it twice before folding it carefully and placing it back into the envelope. They also mentioned recognition for the hospital, Doyle added, discreetly, of course, given the classified nature of everything. But this is exactly the kind of story that reminds people why places like this matter. I don't need recognition, Maria said quietly. I just wanted him to live. I know, Doyle said. But sometimes recognition finds people anyway, whether they're looking for it or not. That evening, Maria drove home along familiar streets, the city lights reflecting softly against her windshield, her thoughts drifting between the events of the past several weeks and the quiet, ordinary life waiting for her at home. Tyler was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in, homework spread out in front of him, though his attention lifted the moment she entered. Long shift? He asked. Eventful few weeks, Maria said, setting her bag down and taking a seat across from him. She hesitated for a moment before reaching into her bag and pulling out the small cigar box she had carried with her that day, the same box that had once belonged to Eric, filled with old photographs and worn field manuals she hadn't shared with anyone in years. I want to tell you something about your father, she said quietly, sliding the box gently across the table. Something I probably should have shared with you a long time ago. Tyler looked at the box, then at his mother, curiosity and cautious hope flickering behind his eyes. Okay, he said softly. I'd like that. Tyler lifted the lid of the box carefully, his fingers brushing over the worn edges of the old field manuals before settling on a photograph of his father in uniform, younger and leaner than Tyler had ever known him, standing beside a group of men whose faces had long since faded from memory, but whose expressions still carried the easy confidence of people who trusted one another completely. He looks happy here, Tyler said softly. He was, Maria said. That was before you were born, back when he still believed the hardest part of his life was already behind him. Did he ever talk about it? What he actually did over there? Not often, Maria admitted, but enough, over the years, that some of it stayed with me without my realizing it. Enough that when I needed it most, without even thinking, I already knew what to do. She told him then, carefully and slowly, about the man who had come through her hospital doors weeks earlier, about the 8 minutes that had felt like an hour, about the federal agents and the classified mission, and the strange, quiet way one stranger's survival had somehow led her back to sharing his father's story with him at last. Tyler listened without interrupting, his eyes moving occasionally back down to the photograph in his hands, absorbing every word with the kind of attention he rarely gave anything these days. I wish I remembered more about him, Tyler said eventually. You will, Maria said. We'll go through this box together, slowly, whenever you're ready. There's no rush anymore. As the evening settled into a quiet, comfortable rhythm, Maria found herself finally opening the door to a part of her past she had kept closed for far too long, understanding now, more clearly than ever, that the courage it took to save a stranger's life in 8 desperate minutes was the same courage it took to finally share her own story with the people who needed to hear it most. Somewhere across the city, in a hospital room slowly emptying of guards and government agents, Daniel Cole rested peacefully for the first time in weeks, alive because a stranger had refused to let him go, and because, in the end, the truth, however difficult to share, had always been simpler than the silence surrounding it.